Um, okay, I think we're
It says it's recording.
okay. Great. Yeah, I've been doing well. I told you about my grandfather, so that was kind of a little blow, an unexpected blow. But yeah, I'm getting back into the rhythm of things. So, how have you been?
Yeah, I've been okay. Like some mental health stuff as well, I guess, in terms of just constantly being focused on this type of stuff can get a bit shitty.
Yep.
But then you kind of snap out of it every once in a while. And like I'm used to it because I've been sort of covering this stuff for a while, and it's something I know about myself that like if I like focus on this stuff for a long time, it like can have a bit of a detrimental effect. Kind of have to remind yourself that actually it's not all negative things happening in the world. There's like positive developments happening all the time and stuff.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah, I agree with the mental health effect of I suppose paying too much attention.
yeah.
But usually with that, I try to dial it back and think of the people who are really suffering. I mean, not that mental health isn't suffering in and of itself, but it's much worse for someone in Gaza or in Yemen, for example.
Absolutely.
So,
and that's why that's why I'm a journalist at the end of the day as well.
Okay, great. So just gonna grab some notes here. I guess so I'll just start with a brief intro. This will be edited in the final cut. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the first episode of Facts on the Ground. I'm very pleased to have with me as my first guest, writer and journalist Tareq Haddad, who's based in London. He recently resigned from Newsweek and has since started his own newswire service called The Watchdog, which you can find at thewatchdog.com, correct?
.net.
.net, sorry.
That domain.
What's that?
That domain wasn't available.
Oh, okay.
I tried.
So, Tareq, if we can we start with just a brief background, who you are, how you came to journalism, and then sort of work into the Newsweek, what happened at Newsweek, and go on to the larger story from there.
Sure. So it's kind of like a fairly longish story, but I was born in Jordan in the Middle East. Came to the UK when I was about I was 8 years old. So kind of lived through sort of was fairly young when the sort of September 11 attacks and the Iraq War. That I think had a kind of a fairly big influence, even though I didn't realize at the time, on me. Kind of growing up, I was always very aware of how Arabs and Russians were always portrayed in the media, because I'm also half Russian. I'm half Arabic, half Russian. So I was always aware of kind of how what I was reading in the news wasn't representative of my experience of those cultures, overwhelmingly positive experience of those cultures. And, kind of didn't really become political till my sort of early 20s. So I wasn't really ever thinking politically. Did a finance degree, was into basketball, all these sort of different things. And kind of as I started to kind of, my intellectual curiosity started to kind of grow, I started to become a lot more political. It was sort of the same time as the Occupy movement. So I think it was a time when a lot of people were getting much more political. So kind of questioning all the inequality and all the sort of problems and downsides of capitalism that we saw at that time. So yeah, kind of that sort of set me off thinking about lots of different things. I was working in finance at the time, and I was also kind of in an industry that was kind of very perpetuates tax evasion, essentially helps large corporations pay less taxes. It's an offshore tax center. So, we had clients that were sort of Qatari royal family members and sort of the biggest tech companies, all based on this like little island off the coast of the United Kingdom. That's where these companies would be registered. So if you imagine a company like Apple, even though it has offices all over the world, it considers its head office somewhere like Jersey, and that's just so all the money can go through there for tax reasons. Right. So kind of when I wasn't aware of kind of how that whole system operated when I started. It was just kind of straight out of college, had a finance degree, just kind of trying to find a job. And it was kind of as I was becoming more aware, I was realizing that actually I'm kind of embedded in this system that's kind of causing this, this corruption. So that was the time I decided to become a journalist. So I kind of wrote a piece about tax evasion and then started doing my training. And like I mentioned before, because of the issues of Russia and the Middle East, I was always kind of, foreign affairs is always what interested me most. So it was kind of what I spent most of my time reading about and researching, and also the issue of propaganda, which I think kind of has helped me a great deal in kind of my current circumstances. I studied propaganda and did my journalism training, kind of worked my way from the ground up, doing sort of regional placements and work experience, and then to a local newspaper, and then kind of slowly made it up the ranks to kind of be able to cover politics and international foreign affairs at a kind of international level. So that was there. So in 2016, I was working for the International Business Times, which is kind of the sister company of Newsweek at the time. They had owned Newsweek. I was writing about Syria, about foreign affairs, all that kind of thing. And then we had this kind of change in the Google algorithm in 2016, where lots of companies started to essentially not make any money from journalism, because lots of, if you weren't the New York Times or the Washington Post, everyone's search rankings got pushed if they weren't doing kind of original source. And because IB Times was doing a lot of clickbaity type stuff, lots of journalists were let go, and I was one of them, unfortunately. And I kind of decided I didn't really want to get back into or try and find another journalism job. I was already feeling a little bit frustrated about not being kind of tell the truth about Syria or lots of other foreign affairs issues. It wasn't like I couldn't tell the truth, but I always couldn't tell the full picture, or I couldn't express it or it was also the fact that there wasn't even any interest. So I would be writing, or I'd want to write these sort of big investigative pieces on Syria or whatever, and then editors would just say, we're not really interested, we'd rather you do something that was, and it always tended to be kind of more entertainment, more kind of clickbaity type, that no one, for me, that's not what I go into journalism for. So 2016 and then for 2 years, I decided to try and write a book, because I was, writing and literature is something that's kind of deeply important to me. So I was kind of felt that was an avenue that I could try and express what I wanted to write more honestly and without kind of any layers preventing me from doing so. But obviously, writing a book is a very, very difficult and hard, long process. And I was, just to be purely honest, I was just a bit naive. I thought I could go and write this bestseller in 2 years and come back and not have to worry about all these things. But 2 years later, I kind of realized, okay, one, this is actually much more difficult than I envisaged, even though I learned a lot from that process. And I wouldn't be who I am now without having written or attempted to write that book. But so I kind of 2 years later, I realized, okay, I have to kind of go back to the UK, because I was living in Europe, teaching English, to support myself while I was writing. So I kind of said, okay, I'm turning 30 this summer, so I have to kind of grow up. All my friends are getting married, houses, that kind of thing. So I moved back to London, came back to journalism, kind of something that I knew that I could just rely on. Didn't really have any intentions of being controversial or kind of making this big fuss. Just kind of honestly just wanted to kind of get back to back to sort of civilization and just kind of got on with my life. The Syria issue had died down at the time, so I wasn't really, that wasn't something that was ongoing. So it was just kind of about 2 weeks after I started, the kind of Turkey's campaign in Syria started, and the Trump's announcement of his withdrawal. So yeah, it kind of just, that all kind of happened without any of my control, and it was just sort of a chain of events where I just felt like I had to kind of say what I did and resign eventually from Newsweek. So
right.
I don't know if I need to go into some of his details.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, that was great. That was great. Yeah. So if we can talk about the OPCW story and and essentially the censorship that you experienced at Newsweek, and that caused you to resign. So what's happening with the OPCW? There was the initial investigation, and then an interim report written and a final report written, and experts who are on the ground in Douma have contradicted and the final report's conclusions, and have said that crucial information has been omitted. For example, that they believe the cylinders were placed as opposed to dropped from a plane or a helicopter, for example. But so that's just to give some background to what's happening with the OPCW. But can you talk about what happened at Newsweek when you wanted to pursue this story, and the pushback you received?
Sure. Just to quickly clarify, I guess, for people that don't know, the OPCW is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the UN's chemical weapons sort of watchdog for kind of these types of incidents. So in about mid-November, I believe it was, I started to, even though actually the story had been kind of around for longer than I had known. It kind of, I think it'd been around since the summer. I think Aaron Mate had done some reporting. Unfortunately, kind of due to the nature of how much information we're all under at the moment, it was just something that didn't, even though I followed Syria closely, but it's just, I was just starting that job. I was trying to kind of settle in. I wasn't aware of those particular details, but as it kind of slowly started to come to my attention, and then there was, at that early stage, there wasn't too much evidence. But then, it started kind of building sort of almost on a week-by-week basis, where we had WikiLeaks sort of releasing official documents kind of every couple of weeks. I think they've put out 4 batches of documents in total. So yeah, that kind of started to come, and then there was also reporting here in the UK from Peter Hitchens, who works at the Mail on Sunday. So, I was already aware of the story, kind of trying to build evidence where I can. Hitchens writes his story on the Sunday, I think it was the 25th of November, and I sort of bring it up to my editors on the following Monday saying, we should also report on this, because the amount of evidence that was there now, to me, kind of in my journalistic background, it was more than enough to run the story. It wasn't, we had the original documents from, no one denied the veracity of the documents. Other mainstream journalists had written about it. That is, in my experience, that's complete green light. It doesn't matter how controversial it is, really. But yeah, so I started to kind of get a bit of pushback, really, no kind of willingness to engage with the story, and it was very immediate that the kind of natural tendency of the editor I was talking to was to kind of try and attack the sources of where the information came from. So it was kind of attacking Peter Hitchens, his credibility as a reporter, or his newspaper that he works for. Odd comments would have been made about WikiLeaks, and kind of completely nonsensical to anyone with a brain that they're not linked to Russian intelligence or anything like that. But you get these kind of throwback comments. Oh, what about WikiLeaks? Dodgy. It's all kind of rubbish. So, I push back against this, kind of insisting that this is an important story, and I believe, that the evidence tells you everything you need to know. And then it was kind of the second phase was sort of I was forwarded this article by Bellingcat, which is kind of the sort of US and UK's empire's propaganda agency, for without going into too much detail, but they're essentially this group of journalists.
Like they're intelligence Blackwater.
Yeah, I mean, they make out to be sort of investigative journalists, but they're not. They're kind of ex-trolls that have been paid by certain think tanks like the Atlantic Council. And there's a long list now of kind of things that they've put out that's been misleading or inaccurate. So anyway, so I was sent this article by Bellingcat, which kind of said this is why these leaks are all rubbish and shouldn't be taken seriously. I was already aware that Bellingcat was kind of this propaganda service, even though the feeling
and that came from. I'm sorry, that came from Bellingcat directly.
That came from an editor. My foreign affairs editor at Newsweek.
Okay.
He seemed to actually be friends with Elliot Higgins, who's the founder of Bellingcat.
Right.
So in the piece that I wrote about in my resignation, I also mentioned how my editor had these links to think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations and the European Council of Foreign Relations. And I think that's kind of the big problem in journalism that I tried to touch on, is that too many people in the industry have links to other think tanks. You kind of have that same revolving door problem that you've got with almost every other sort of aspect of government at the moment. And so it was something that I wasn't aware of in journalism so much. That's why I wrote my piece. But yeah, so instead of kind of just saying to my editor that, Bellingcat is just essentially propaganda and a load of rubbish, I took the article that they gave me and kind of decimated it point by point, saying, because it was a long refutation of all the different facts that had come out, saying this isn't. So I kind of refuted that and said point by point why their rationale or reasoning wasn't logical or it wasn't factual, with evidence, with links, with pictures. And, at that point, they just didn't have anything to say. They just said, we're sorry, afraid it's no, we can't run the story. And then there was kind of this 1 week period where I kind of knew that I'd exhausted all options with that editor. So I was trying to speak to my sort of London editor-in-chief and the New York editor-in-chief, who I'd been working closely with on other stories, and they praised me and given me good feedback, and I thought I had a good relationship with them. But I started to kind of get there was a very unwillingness to talk to me. I tried to talk to my London editor for a week. We're in the same office. She sat kind of three desks down from me. I kept trying, can we go and talk about this? And, kept essentially getting brushed aside. I'm sorry, I'm too busy right now. But it was kind of very obvious that I was, getting brushed aside. So that was happening for a week. And also I was getting a lot of, I would say, kind of undue criticism on my other pieces. So it was kind of like this deliberate tactic of almost making my life more difficult. So this particular editor, who was an entertainment editor, it wasn't even a sort of the typical editor that I would be dealing with, was sort of specifically assigned to pick up my stories that I'd been writing. And they essentially, even though I've been a trusted journalist for a long time and never really ever had any issues, that editor started to give me kind of all my articles were sent back to me with lots of criticism and lots of points for correction, and asking me to find details that are kind of very obscure and hard to find. But it was just kind of like a clear sign of, don't focus on that serious story. You need to be, you're falling behind in your work and the things that we want you to do.
Right.
So it's essentially, and I didn't realize it till afterwards, but it was kind of, once I got this email from Laura, who was my editor, to kind of summarize, they started attacking me essentially in this email to say, that we're not going to run this story, but we really want you to be focusing on, and she gave me like a list of 10 points that had come directly from that other editor. And I kind of quickly realized what was going on. It wasn't to do with, my quality of my journalism. It was because I was trying to write this story.
Right.
And that's when I kind of went public with everything and just decided to publish my piece.
Right. And just so listeners know, you can read that piece on Tareq's website. It's tareqhaddad.com, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And I do recommend you read it. It's you have all the communications in there between you and your editors, and yeah, the pushback that you received is, I think any fair-minded person would say, pretty ridiculous, and not really focused on the facts of the story or even the story whatsoever. And I'm curious why you think that they pushed back the way they did. Do you think they were afraid to just, be the nail that sticks up with this story, or do you think there were other larger factors at play, larger factors putting pressure on them to can the story?
I think it's partly that. I don't think there's anyone sort of in an office somewhere that's kind of telling them not to run this story. And I've thought about this a lot. I think what ends up happening is that there's kind of becomes this sort of institutionalized thinking among these places. So it's kind of, certain belief systems will become like a common thing amongst a group without them really knowing that it's kind of their ideology or their kind of groupthink. And I think it, particularly happened to me because it was kind of almost naive because I'd gone away from the industry for 2 years. And I think what had happened in those 2 years is that the quality of journalism had actually dropped significantly then, when I left, and I kind of wasn't aware of these things. I wasn't sort of following these things ins and outs. And I wasn't in newsrooms to kind of see that decline. So it was kind of just, I was just sort of expressing myself of, this is ridiculous, not knowing that actually the whole kind of mentality around me had shifted, and this is kind of now how everyone thought. But so I think actually it was more that obviously I think there was definitely pressure on them not to, stick their neck out. But I think it wasn't for the most part, other than the editor that I kind of singled out in my piece, who has these links to other think tanks and, sort of, I would say, things that are not appropriate for a journalist in terms of conflict of interest. But I think with the majority of the people that I worked with, even the ones that sort of gave me pushback, it's actually that they're not, firstly, not aware of propaganda and how it works. And also they just don't question, they're just not, it's sad to say, and they're just not kind of solid journalists where they actually are willing to question the government line. Kind of they've forgotten what journalism is actually about. It's kind of, I think people in there are kind of just happy to do their job, go, do a 9 to 5, go back to their kids and families and whatever, without really kind of engaging in what the responsibility of a journalist is. You're kind of in that office and you kind of forget that your stuff's going out to millions of people and it has this big influence. I think so. It's just everyone gets in this routine of covering the news as it's been covered, and it's kind of, you just, with all the different pressures that everyone's talks about, it's just kind of, there's this rush to get stories out with, attracts as much attention to us than, that would be going to other websites. And, we're all conscious of that. So I think it's just one of those things where the institutional thinking has this certain view, and it takes someone from the outside to say, hey, this is actually wrong. And,
Yeah, and it's quite ironic that Newsweek has become so focused. Newsweek and a lot of other mainstream media outlets have become so focused on getting these clickbait stories out as quickly as possible, which often come back to bite them somehow because they're poorly sourced or poorly researched. And here you are presenting something that's well researched, well documented, essentially verified, and it's anathema to them. I think that's a very grotesque irony that's pervading a lot of mainstream media, especially. So maybe we can talk a little bit more, just in depth, about what happened in Douma in 2018. This was where an alleged chemical weapons attack took place, and it was used to justify U.S. airstrikes on Syria on April 13 of 2018, I believe. It was my birthday, so it must have been April 13. I remember listening to James Mattis that night justify the strikes. But maybe we can talk just a little bit about what happened in Douma for those listeners who might not be familiar.
So I believe the actual alleged attack was on April 8th, if I'm not mistaken, or around that time, sort of early April. Yeah, this sort of, I wasn't actually a journalist at that time, but it's kind of good to remember that these things and the whole of the Syria conflict is kind of, you have to remember everything in the deeper context of it and the sort of history of Syria. So obviously I was aware that the whole Syria narrative was a falsehood from the very first days of the war. It was completely obvious to me, and I'm sure to many other people as well on the sort of anti-war left, and there was big demonstrations.
Just to be honest on my part, I wasn't at first. It was, I guess, not doing enough research on my part, where I did initially think, Assad is this horrendous dictator, and he needs to be removed from power. But I was thinking more in terms of Syrian society removing him from power, not NATO or some kind of military axis. But that changed. Yeah, that changed quickly when I started to see that the narrative was not only just heavily skewed in toward regime change, but there was a Russophobic narrative to it. There was an anti-Iran narrative to it, and then there's been some great reporting done at the Gray Zone by Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton and Aaron Mate, Anya Parampil as well, exposing the White Helmets propaganda campaign, which maybe we can talk about. But I was one of those who initially sort of bought into the fact that Assad is this brutal dictator who's just ruthlessly murdering everyone in Syria he can, so they don't revolt. But that clearly wasn't the case, as we know. So anyway, just to get back to our discussion of Douma, I just wanted to interject there that I was one of the early sort of not regime change believers, but it was hard to find. There wasn't information readily available at that time to give an alternative point of view. Nobody was really doing the work.
Well, can I say something about that? Because I think actually kind of touched on an important point, but also firstly, thanks for having the courage to actually say that, because I think that's among journalists or politicians, that's just not something you hear of. I was wrong on this position and I changed my mind, and I think that's a great thing to see. But I think the point you touches on, and I think it's kind of how it affects the sort of wider public, is that we hear a lot about sort of Chinese and Russian and Syrian propaganda, but you have to remember that propaganda was invented in the United States, and it has a long history of the United States, and Americans are the best at propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
As America is the leading country with, technology and all these kind of different things, they're also, leading in that field. And there was, after, sort of maybe late 2000, sort of that decade, 2000, 2010, when we had this big shift to social media, Facebook, Twitter, and everything started to kick off in a big way. What people realized, that working for militaries, is that actually, they realized that there was this sort of new stream of information that was, took over the world, and that's where we get things like Bellingcat and the Integrity Initiative and the White Helmets. They all exist because there was a realization that all these videos and all these sort of Twitter and everything is a very easy way to kind of grip people emotively. So, a lot of the propaganda we see are just these sort of 30-second short clips on Twitter, we're living in these very sort of complicated and busy lives where people don't have the time to go and investigate investigating chemical weapons attacks is a long and difficult business. So, the average person that's got a family and kids and a day job doesn't have time to do that. They just kind of rely on what's there on Twitter and what's even coming out of mainstream news sources, because, we've had that traditional respect for them. And to be honest, I think a lot of newspapers got duped by this. They're fed this footage from Syria when it was very difficult for mainstream publications to send reporters to Syria. They're essentially an employer. Their staff might get killed. It was extremely dangerous. Iraq was very dangerous. So, and the money in journalism was dying. It was difficult to have people in these places. So when organizations like the White Helmets popped up conveniently to kind of, here is this ready-made video for you with our good intentions, I don't blame people for kind of falling for it, because it was this it was this new revolutionary way of propaganda. No one had done propaganda like that before. So it was natural that some people were going to fall for it. And I guess it was natural that, we're at this stage now where there's becoming a greater realization of misinformation and these kind of tactics.
Right. Yeah, that was something I wanted to touch on too, the White Helmets. So maybe we can just talk about them quickly, and then go back to what happened at Douma. Unless you want to stick on Douma, but the White Helmets essentially are the civil service arm of the Islamic State in Syria. There was a Netflix documentary made about them, they were funded by James Mercier, I believe is how you pronounce, who died under mysterious circumstances not so long ago. There was a Netflix documentary made about them. It won an Oscar, and people were led to believe that they were this just sort of messianic group of rescuers. And the truth is that they only operate in ISIS or Al Qaeda controlled territory. There's been footage of them rushing into scenes of summary executions right after they happen to take the body away. Dan Cohen, who was at RT, I'm not sure if he's still with them now, but he made a very good short documentary about this. And when he presented that documentary to a filmmaker, I forget his name right now, but a filmmaker who had made another one of these propaganda documentaries about Syria in favor of regime change, essentially. It was just, the filmmaker just said, "This is fucking bullshit. This is something you got off of Sputnik or RT." And So with regard to the white helmets and the other propaganda that's been put out there, in terms of Syria, why do you think that these these Hollywood folks and you have these like self-styled hipster journalists like Molly Crabapple. Why do you think they're so invested in regime change in Syria?
Mhm.
What's in it for them, do you think? Why are they trying to convince us that this isn't propaganda, that this is, how things on the ground actually are?
Hmm. Well, I think I don't know too much about the history of this personally, but I know, kind of just tangentially, I know that Hollywood and propaganda have had a long history of being intertwined, and so many sort of action movies and so on are kind of veiled in a lot of propaganda. A typical, I can't remember the I better not name any actors to piss anyone off, but not that they're watching my interviews, but you never know. Oh, Mark Wahlberg, I was going to say, you know,
Oh yeah,
like
Bradley Cooper.
yeah, those kind of films. There's sometimes they're entertaining, but there definitely is a lot of propaganda in there that sort of every US soldier there is kind of this heroic figure, and every Middle Eastern person is kind of this maniac,
Hmm.
screaming, kind of illogical terrorist kind of character.
Yeah,
Um,
it's like a hyper Orientalist perspective.
yeah. Um, so that's always something that's been there. And in terms of sort of journalists and kind of people, I think again it just goes down to that issue of people not being aware how they're being manipulated. Um, and I think a lot of it to do is it's kind of we've become this culture that's sort of dominated by money essentially and influence. So it's kind of if you're a young graduate from Columbia Journalism School, you come out, you're 20, whatever, you're looking to do journalism, and then someone gives you this opportunity. But to keep that job and to make those connections and then to be given promotions and to you have to kind of no one's directly telling you, but there's certain things that you have to kind of toe the line on and not you can't just kind of graduate, or you can't just join kind of a newspaper and then write on your very early on in your career that whatever the Russiagate narrative is completely false or whatever. And
Yeah.
usually there's obviously a long process before you're trusted to even write about those stories. You have to kind of work your way up through doing all sorts of different stuff. Um, so I think that's mostly what it is, and it's people just not being educated. I would the amount of journalists that are writing about Syria that don't actually understand the history of Syria before all of this happened
Right.
um, is very evident. And even now, you see the exact same mentality of. I was writing in 2016 about these not hostage deals, these evacuation deals that were done between sort of the terrorist factions or the militias, or whatever you want to call them, in the Syrian government. So, or maybe it was 2017. But anyway, so there was this deal made. It was kind of struck up with Turkey and Russia and all these countries in Kazakhstan, in Astana, but they agreed to move people in Idlib that were supportive of
Hmm.
the government. To evacuate them to government-held areas, and
Which,
then
just for those listeners who don't know, that's a province in northern Syria,
mm,
Idlib province, the last stronghold, I guess you could say, of the Islamic State in Syria.
uh-huh,
Uh, um, but go ahead, please.
yeah, so we had this deal. So people that were supportive of Bashar al-Assad and his government left on their own volition, and people that wanted to join, the families of the fighters that wanted to join the kind of those communities were welcome to join there. So and we had this deal made, and pretty much it was agreed. And so this is completely antithetical to what you're seeing in the media now. It's kind of, oh, what the devastation that's happening to Idlib right now, and the brutality and the insanity of the Assad regime. But it's like, did you forget that 2 years ago we were writing that all of the ISIS fighters were moving into Idlib and that Syrian families were moving out? And actually, during those evacuations, the ISIS fighters, or the Tahrir al-Sham, I believe it was, they attacked those buses that were taking Syrians supportive of the government out. I think maybe 50 people were killed in those evacuations. And that got zero coverage, pretty much.
I that's the first time I'm hearing of that, so I'll definitely look into that incident. But if we can just go back to Douma real quick and what happened there. So there was this alleged chemical weapons attack. Not long after that, the Syrian government opened up the area for reporters to come in. Robert Fisk from The Independent, longtime war correspondent, excellent reporter, excellent writer. He went there and interviewed people on the ground, and some of them told him that they had no knowledge whatsoever of a chemical attack. They didn't know what he was talking about. And yet in the Western media, we were pumped full of these images of corpses on the ground with froth coming out of their nostrils and their mouths, and children being doused in water in hospitals. So hence the OPCW investigation. And maybe if you could just talk about what the investigators, I know I summarized this a little bit earlier, but what the investigators on the ground found there, and then what their superiors, for whatever reason, have decided to try to suppress.
Yeah, and I think some of these details are actually fairly important. So the investigators went there, and I think this is a really important point, because some of these whistleblowers now are receiving attacks, and people are questioning their credibility. So this group of, I believe it was 11 scientists, they went out to Douma in the middle of a devastating war zone that's extremely dangerous. That's the kind of point that I want to raise. And the fact that they were sent there, shows that they were trusted to, they weren't just being sent to any site. They were being sent to sort of the center of, all the world is watching this. So, it has to be remembered that these people wouldn't have been sent to Douma if they were not professionals with a long history of not being political. They would just go and do the scientific work that was necessary, and that's why they're speaking out right now. So they went, did their investigations of 2 different sites called Location 2 and Location 4. I think, speaking to some of the people that have spoken to the whistleblowers firsthand, they were saying that within an hour, they had established that it was very unlikely that it was a chemical weapons attack, and it was more likely that it was staged. They were able to tell that within 1 hour.
Within an hour?
Within an hour. And that's so.
Wow.
Some of the evidence justifies that claim, because if you look at I believe the Location 4, where I think the canister is on a bed.
Okay.
There's kind of like this broken big double bed, and it's kind of laying across it. But
for listeners who don't, sorry to interrupt again, just for listeners who don't know, one canister was found on the roof of a building, correct, and another was found inside a building, as if it had penetrated the building and landed in there. So just to clarify that, but yeah, go ahead, please.
So on that in the incident with the bed, the actual hole where the incident allegedly came through doesn't correspond to where the canister is on the bed. So, it must have, according to the people that say that there was an alleged chemical weapons attack, they say that it came and bounced in this one point in the room, and it sort of rugby balled its way across to the bed. But it's like a extremely heavy canister, and it's kind of completely impossible under any laws of physics that it would land here. And there was also no markings or scratchings on any of this wooden surfaces. The inspectors found none of that. So it was kind of impossible for it to end up there. And then, there was other, lots of little inconsistencies. The other main issue is that they tested for chlorine and they tested for other chemical weapons, and they found that there was trace elements of chlorine and no other sort of chemical weapons such as sarin, which is very convenient, very obviously compelling. They said that there's no chlorine levels higher than what would be normally found in the normal atmosphere.
Right.
They write their report as they would normally would. The samples get sent to Porton Down in the UK, which is the UK's sort of chemical testing facility. And then this is according to one of the news reports. The results came back to the OPCW, and there was just kind of silence, and kind of no one was willing to actually kind of address the fact that these results essentially were not what had been wanted. And then we now know that there was a meeting sort of several days before the final report came out, where 3 US intelligence officials were in the office with the OPC Director General at the time, Sebastian Brahe, who's this French diplomat. So they had this meeting with some other senior OPCW officials, including Ian Henderson, who's the lead. I believe he was in that meeting. He's the one that led the team to Douma. So he was present when they kind of presented these alternative kind of findings. And it has to be made clear that the second report that was published to the media and to the whole world to consume was written completely in Turkey by inspectors that had not visited Douma. So the second team that had written this report was completely made up, except for one person who was a paramedic on the original trip. He was the only one that was involved in the second process. And also James Lemazeria, who we mentioned as the founder of the White Helmets, was also involved in arranging the interviews for the OPCW. So he was facilitating the interviews with the alleged victims. So there's obviously some suspicious things going on there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Do you, just to touch on that, do you do you have any background on that? Like how that came to be? Or is it just one of these things that cropped up? Here's our, our go-between, this Lemaseurier guy, and he seems to be an expert propagandist. So we'll have him conduct the interviews. Do you think it was something like that, or incidental?
Purely speculative. But obviously he was a former army officer for the British Army. Links to sort of psychological warfare units and propaganda units, essentially. So I don't have the sort of specifics or the evidence, but I know that, reporters that I trust have kind of spoken of these things kind of just when we were casually discussing them. So I'm sure there is kind of more information on that available, or it's something for someone to dig into. But yeah, I would say that it was a coordinated, because he was the sort of go-to person for arranging these types of things anyway. if he's sort of dealing with the white helmets, they're already engaged in staging these attacks and doing manipulation with the victims and that kind of thing. So he would have been the natural person for that role.
Right.
And I think also, again, this is purely speculative, but it kind of can possibly give us some essential hints into his possible cause of death, because we know that Russia had become much more aware of these things. There was this, I think he's an academic, not a journalist, Maxim Grigoriev, who documented a lot of the stuff about the white helmets. And, Russia's been talking about the white helmets and the propaganda for a while, and the sort of influence of Turkey and all that kind of thing. So I think, there was probably a lot more going on there than what we know.
Right.
Evidence that, according to some journalists I've spoken to, they say that the building that he fell off was not like it's not the kind of building you jump off to commit suicide. It wasn't tall enough.
Right.
And the evidence showed that he was kind of trying to run and reach a distance. So he was trying to jump between two walls or something like that.
Yeah.
So, there seems to be kind of some sort of incident that happened just before.
Mm-hmm. So, sorry?
No, sorry, I forgot the point that we were on after that.
Oh, I think that's my fault for going on a tangent. Not knowing about Le Mesurier and his role in interviewing those witnesses. So the final report comes out, the one that's presented to the public, and it's clearly thanks to the OPCW investigators who have come forward and let us know, there's clearly vital evidence that's been suppressed. So where in your reporting, where does the OPCW scandal, if you will, it should be an international scandal, but where does it stand as of right now? Well, maybe let's dial it back. So, like, these canisters were found in these certain places, and the investigators put that in their report. That's mainly what was suppressed, that the fact that these canisters were likely placed, that there was no abnormal amount of chlorine in the air. And as you said, they went into a war zone to do this. They put their lives at risk, and they're receiving death threats now for coming forward. Do you know where everything stands as of now? Is it just kind of like in a limbo, or are these investigators going to take some sort of action to get the facts out there, even though they already are out there? But
well, so there's a couple of things have happened. So the OPCW itself kind of did this. I wouldn't say it was a real investigation, but they kind of allegedly did this investigation. They put out a report a couple of weeks ago where they were kind of looking into this. But it was kind of not a report at what happened in Douma. It was actually a report into why these whistleblowers had spoken out. And they were not referred to as whistleblowers or so on. It was kind of, we had a repetition of the kind of lies that have been perpetrated to say that, these were unauthorized leaks that came from people that were unhappy about these findings. It doesn't mention that it comes from the lead investigator that led the team, who is an OPCW veteran for over 10 years, that wouldn't have been sent there if he wasn't capable of doing that job. That's completely false, taken out of context. So we have, we have two original whistleblowers, and now actually in the last week we've now reached a fourth. So Aaron Mate has just published something. I think it was maybe yesterday or 2 days ago. Someone within the team who's still working for the OPCW has kind of come out to say that there's a serious atmosphere of intimidation and of physical threats of violence to people for speaking out. And, you know, they kind of forget the exact quotes, but they said it was unacceptable. And they also wanted to come out because their treatment of essentially their colleagues and longtime workers is not acceptable to them. So now we've reached a point where there's 4 whistleblowers, and still the kind of mainstream media silence on it is you know, complete blanket silence on the whole issue.
Yeah, there's literally no coverage whatsoever here that I've seen on CNN, MSNBC, Fox. Why, in your estimation, do you think the OPCW is doing this? Why are they so committed to suppressing the truthful findings of what their own experts found?
So yeah, I wouldn't say it's the actual OPCW itself, and actually, you know, I think that was kind of a point I was making, is that, you know, these experts and the OPCW do important work, and, you know, the integrity of that organization needs to be protected. I think this is much more a UK influencing its exerting its influence on the body, and, you know, what happened at the OPCW is actually fits in a much wider pattern of something that's been happening for 50 to 70 years, which is sort of since World War II, the UK and the US have systematically broken international law for sort of the gains of empire, or, you know, for militaristic aims, and that kind of disrespect for law is just kind of gradually getting worse and worse. And, you know, we've had incidents like this, you know, throughout the last 50 years. It's just what tends to happen, like this case, is that they don't get reported on. People in the wider public aren't aware of them. But, you know, I mean, everyone knows about the sort of weapons of mass destruction lie from Iraq, but you have the exact same thing in the first Gulf War. I don't know if you're aware of the example of the 15-year-old girl, or
the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, who testified that Saddam's troops, Iraqi troops, were throwing babies out of incubators, which turned out to be a complete lie, but was used to sell the war to the public, and to Congress.
Yeah, facilitated by Amnesty International.
Right.
So
yeah, and just to dovetail off that real quickly, with regard to the war in Syria, there was sort of a similar child figure put forward, Bana Al Abed. I don't know if you remember her. Jake Tapper even tweeted out, if you want news on Syria, follow Bana. And again, Dan Cohen, he did it's a short documentary, about 20 minutes, but he did a really good expose on the propaganda campaign surrounding the war in Syria, and he highlights her. I think she was feted at the Oscars or something like that, and then you know, it turns out she's basically being coached by parents who are who are anti-Assadists, and it's another propaganda scheme to get people to buy into regime change, to buy into war, and it's again grotesquely ironic that history is repeating itself in that way, and the propaganda it's the same, but it's becoming more refined with technology. So just going back to why the OPCW is taking the position it is, you were talking about US UK influence, and you think this is another strategy by both countries to continue to try to make the case for war or regime change in Syria?
So, what? Sorry, I missed part of that question.
So going back to the position that OPCW is taking, you mentioned external influence from the US and the UK. You think they're trying to exert pressure on the OPCW as sort of a way to continue to try to bring about this regime change that they seem to be obsessed with?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think it's just kind of, it was something that they thought that they could get away with, essentially. And there's probably countless incidents that we never hear about where things have happened and, no one's really spoken out about it because of this culture of intimidation and fear about certain things. Yes, I don't think there's any question about that. I think it's just now a matter of what happens next and what other countries do, and whether we get enough of a political shift in our own countries to kind of say that these kind of things are unacceptable. But unfortunately, what kind of the worrying pattern of, especially now with what we see with coronavirus and, there's so many issues to focus on. It seems like that we're kind of in this sort of rapid state of sort of dysfunction and increasing disintegration. And it's all, to me, it seems very apparent that it's all kind of linked to the same thing of we're basing our societies based off of what's profitable from an empire point of view. We have this kind of vision of eternal, never-ending growth, which is kind of this impossible thing. We're living on this planet with finite resources, but all of the world's companies have this target that they must reach 5% growth every year, otherwise they're not doing a good job. So it's kind of, I think we're reaching that point where, or we've maybe gone past it, where people have chased profits so long that they've sacrificed, the law or morals or what's right and wrong in order just to justify those profits. And when you're in that specific profit chasing environment, you don't even realize the wider context of what's happening.
Yeah, or you do, but you choose not to acknowledge it.
Yeah, I mean, when I was working in the finance industry, and I was starting to kind of realize how corrupt it was. It was kind of like a very eye-opening experience, because some of the people I was working with were like these 40-year-old women with children, and they were like lovely people that, they were purely in this job just to look after their families, and nothing against them as people. But I think we kind of, we have this compartmentalization where, people don't want to really kind of hold themselves accountable for how we're all part of this system that kind of perpetuates this kind of violence.
Right. And also, as you were saying earlier, when you have a job and a family and bills, it is very difficult to find the time to sit down and actually do a critical reading of media, whether it be the New York Times or an independent outlet. So, yeah, it seems to be a mixture of willful ignorance and also just people being so constrained by the capitalist system that, they don't have time to assess the sort of the repression and suppression of the system they're living in, which going back to what you were talking about earlier with studying propaganda, that's something Chomsky touches on in Manufacturing Consent. This fact that the capitalist system is designed to keep us from ever getting to the point where we know too much or we have enough to be comfortable. It's meant to always keep us on the edge of surviving and basic knowledge and lumpen proletariat, as Marx called it.
Yeah, I mean,
but,
I mean,
go ahead.
Maybe I'm kind of nitpicking a bit too much, but I always kind of struggle when this language because I don't think anyone designed it to be this way, And I think our systems of capitalism and the way we, they had this sort of long evolution to reach the point that they are. I think it's just kind of, so I try and avoid kind of that language where we say that, capitalism is designed to do this because it's implicating that someone in a sort of evil boardroom designed these things. I think it's, I mean, there's obviously a lot of truth in what you're saying, but I think it's a kind of much more complicated thing where, we've evolved to reach this certain stage, and there's obviously a great deal of good in capitalism. That's kind of undeniable. But it just has these sort of malignant aspects to it that we need to be more conscious of.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I wasn't trying to suggest that there's a puppet master in a. So so just to finish up with Syria, and then hopefully we could move on to Julian Assange for a little bit, because you've been covering that at the Watchdog. You covered the first week of the extradition hearing. But just before we get to that, I wanted to get your take on Syria now. The Islamic State still being in Idlib, the country trying to reconstruct itself, still a U.S. military presence. Turkey has been using white phosphorus in the Kurdish region. I'm not asking you to make a prediction, but what's your assessment of where Syria stands now? Do you see it reintegrating or further disintegrating?
It's still obviously a very tense situation because we've got this kind of very intense Turkish bombing campaign at the moment, which is kind of very fascinating from a media point of view of kind of how uncritical the coverage of that is, and even when we had that the American withdrawal and Turkey first started the wonderfully called Operation Peace Spring,
taking a page from Israel.
Yeah, or
they like to have these sort of I don't know, feel good names for their murderous operations.
Yeah, it's just typical Orwellian stuff, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, so I think the situation is still going to be extremely volatile for a while, unless there's sort of pressure on Turkey to kind of back down and the US to back down. But there are changes happening in terms of I think sort of Saudi Arabia and the other sort of countries. I forget the actual name. I'm blanking on it, but I think it's the Arab Council or some kind of the sort of League of Nations kind of thing of different Arab countries of kind of sort of. I mean, the general notion is that sort of other Arab countries that had previously turned their back on Bashar al-Assad and were trying to get rid of him. Countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia have now kind of accepted that he's actually he's going to be the leader, and they're not trying to depose him, and they've welcomed him back into these kind of institutions of, they understand that his presence is important for the stability of the region. And interestingly, you even had, I believe it was, some foreign minister of Israel appearing on Arabic television to say, even we don't want to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. They had a different perspective previously, but now they take the position they don't want to depose Bashar al-Assad.
I forget which official it was, but I read this in Max Blumenthal's recent book, The Management of Savagery, which I recommend to listeners who are interested in what we're talking about and a lot of other things related to it. I forget the name of the foreign minister, but yeah, at the time, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, we'd rather have ISIS in Syria than Assad. So it seems you're saying they've changed their tune a bit, and Saudi Arabia as well, I guess, being the primary financier of Islamic State and Al Qaeda. So you're saying it seems they're sort of reorienting and accepting the fact that Assad's going nowhere for the time being.
That seems to be sort of general consensus.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's also kind of coming in a context, kind of all these things are happening in a context where American influence in the Middle East is decreasing very quickly, and China's influence in the Middle East is increasing very, very quickly. And, I think there's a lot of things happening in the background between the US and China right now, because I think, in the last 10 years or so, China's kind of gone from this position of never really having a foreign empire or being involved in foreign politics to now very quickly and very efficiently being involved in foreign politics through their Belt and Road Initiative. And, their kind of version of empire.
Sorry, you said Belt and Road?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. It just got a little glitchy there for a moment.
So, yeah, that's kind of been the Chinese way of doing empire now, and it's seemingly been much more effective than the US way, because the US way has been to kind of pay these militias to try and depose the democratically elected leaders or the sovereign leaders of those countries, to try and get rid of them, and then to have this military faction kind of be their sort of puppets in that country. Whereas, we've had that time and time again and seen how disastrous that is. Why should the people ever accept those people as their leaders? The Chinese way of kind of bringing influence into, bringing countries into their influence has been to kind of give them loans for infrastructure and roads and schools and hospitals. And that's pretty much it, I think, with some sort of trade agreements and that kind of thing. And it seems to be a much more effective way of doing policy. And now, Iraq, for example, is now, in coalition with China, and considering how long the US was trying to kind of control Iraq and bring their government in line with the United States, and then just completely failed because obviously that methodology that we talked about.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's interesting, because a lot of what we hear about, or maybe all of what we hear about China, at least in the mainstream media, is in some negative capacity. And despite the progress they are making, they tend to be written off, sort of like Russia, as China's a communist country, and they're trying to wage a trade war on the United States, and Russia is trying to wage a war on our elections. That's the analysis we get, not what these countries are actually doing. And I'm not trying to glorify any state or their policies, but simply point out that the picture here, at least in the U.S., is it's not even the picture of what's actually happening. It's I don't know what you would call it. It's fantasy. Fantasy propelled by ideology, it seems. Which is why it's good that we have outlets such as yours, like the Watchdog, which you recently started after leaving Newsweek, Newswire service. And you kicked things off. It was about 2 weeks ago now, correct? At the first extradition hearing of Julian Assange. Was that at Belmarsh or nearby?
Yeah, it was in the court there. So it was Belmarsh Magistrates Court. Okay.
And can you talk a little bit about your coverage of that? And by the way, everybody can read this at the Watchdog. Can read Tareq's coverage at the watchdog.net, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
I highly recommend it. It's on the ground coverage, and it really gets to the heart of what's happening to Julian Assange, what's happening in his trial. But Tareq, please, if you could tell us about what you've been reporting on.
Mm-hmm. Well, so when I sort of resigned from Newsweek, I kind of had this big feeling of, there's obviously, I had to kind of make a lot of decisions about what I wanted to do next and things like that. But, something that stood out to me immediately was the importance of the Julian Assange case. So it was kind of, I was in a place where I had to think about myself, but at the same time, it felt totally wrong to do so because, the kind of things that Assange had been that he'd been going through and subjected to, I thought was not only worrying, but I just thought was completely unacceptable. And I kind of, it's almost strange, but I felt like personally obligated to do something. So I wanted to kind of set up this organization because I kind of had this, and it's, anyone that's followed Assange for a while knows that the media coverage hasn't been as good as it, or as, well, maybe accurate, but not as, well, yeah, just not as accurate as it should be. And there's been kind of a lot of kind of fake narratives and smears that have been allowed to perpetuate that have never really been corrected.
One of those I'd like to point out, and this has been pointed out before, but I think it's just so egregious that it needs to be continued to be pointed out until it's corrected, is the piece Luke Harding wrote for The Guardian about Assange and Manafort apparently meeting in the Ecuadorian embassy, completely unsourced, and it's still out there, suggesting very strongly, though without sources, that there was a connection between WikiLeaks and the Trump campaign. Yeah, I just wanted to add that. But anyway, go ahead. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, it was just cutting out a little bit, but
oh, okay.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, so I had this feeling that, and rightfully so, that the hearings were not going to be covered as accurately as they should be. So I kind of decided that I was going to try and set this thing up to try and give, because I'm close by, to give news coverage that was accurate, and use the sort of platform that I've been given now, where I've got a slightly kind of bigger reach than I was used to kind of use that opportunity to actually try and tell the truth a bit more about Julian Assange than had been done before. I think it was overwhelmingly successful because, there was I was meeting lots of different people in the courtroom, interacting with other journalists, and sort of we had observers from the European Parliament that came to the court hearings. And, I had it fed back to me that, I kind of through conversations that other people and significant, MPs and politicians were actually reading the news reports that I was writing, which is encouraging.
Yes.
We did video
Great.
and interviews outside of court. We kind of set up this studio where we tried to do this evening podcast every night. Ended up having some really great guests, including the editor of WikiLeaks, Kristen Hrafson, and Joseph Farrell, who's the sort of WikiLeaks ambassador. And we also had, one of Julian Assange's best friends, Jeremy Zimmerman. So that was, really incredible experience, and obviously great to have that coverage. And on a personal note, it was kind of felt very kind of special to me because it was kind of reminded me of the reason that I'd started doing the whole coverage. It was a very stressful week where I was trying to manage a lot of parts, and the things that were happening in court were very kind of distressing and worrying. But to be in kind of this podcast where I was with kind of 4 people that had known Julian personally and that could speak to him on, about his character at a personal level. Jeremy was almost in tears and I was almost crying on that podcast because it kind of really kind of put into perspective what everything meant to, to his friends and to the organization and everything. So kind of it was this moment where I won't forget that, kind of lit my fire to kind of continue doing this this project. So yeah, that was good. I've kind of put together a report last couple of days, which has kind of summarized our whole week of coverage that I'm going to try to extend into May. Unfortunately, it's this organization that's been flung together sort of several weeks ago. This national media organization that's doing several news stories a day with editors and that kind of thing. It's not there yet. But, now I've got sort of a couple of months, so I'm going to be looking at building that structure. I'm also looking to build it in a way that maintains total transparency and maintains a type of journalism that is fact-based and sort of scientific in its nature, and like not susceptible to being corrupted over time, which I think is the biggest problem for a lot of publications. They start out with good intentions and so, but with time they tend to shift and the people change. And we see that with The Intercept, with Amy Goodman's show, Democracy Now.
Yeah.
So it's a very common thing, but
quite disappointing. But with The Intercept, I guess that's what happens when you start to hire former New York Times reporters and NBC reporters. I'm going to call him out because I think he's done a huge disservice to whistleblowers. James Risen, he's been involved with at least 2 whistleblowers who've been sent to prison after his stories were published. And it seems that his only standard for covering a story is that it's a good story, consequences be damned, truth be damned. And it's very disappointing to see that at The Intercept, but I would still advise anybody who's listening to read The Intercept because it's instructive in how independent media, sort of quasi-independent media, can break down and sort of become beholden to mainstream narratives. I say quasi-independent media because, Pierre Omidyar funds them. He's a billionaire. They're not as independent as they sound, but credit where credit's due. They do have, I think, 2 of the finest journalists working today, Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill. So if there's any reason to read them for constructive purposes, there are reports by those two journalists. But anyway, not to shill for the Intercept. But yeah, you were saying you've seen a lot of sort of this degradation in coverage by even independent outlets like that. Even refuse going so far as to refuse to call Assange a journalist or even a publisher sometimes. Just a whistleblower or a leaker. So what has been the atmosphere, if you will, at the trial among journalists? I know that I read in one of your reports that the first day, I believe it was, a bunch of American journalists were there to hear the prosecution and then bailed once Assange's defense team came. So what among the pool of journalists who were covering that week, what was the attitude like?
I mean, I think it's kind of similar. I believe the attitude is among the wider public, in that it seemed to me that obviously there were people there that did care about Assange and that were knowledgeable about his background, and that was encouraging to see. I don't think we should be kind of exaggerating to say that the whole media is against him. I think, there were definitely a lot of journalists there that were supportive of Assange and understood how important this was for the press. We had Australian journalists there. We had a number of journalists from Germany that had these perspectives, and which was very encouraging. Even some of the sort of more American Western ones, they didn't seem to have any particular hostility, even though some did. But I think there was also the sense that I got is that, and maybe this is just because I've covered these things kind of just out of interest so closely, and I've aware of almost every little tiny detail, but it kind of seemed to me that a lot of people don't actually know a lot of the specifics, and they kind of have the image of Assange as painted of him in the mainstream media, and obviously they are working for those publications, so they have that groupthink mentality. But I'm sure there's still a lot of people that kind of will believe, or they will not really question the rape allegations, which and I've been saying this for numerous years, but I'm glad that now we have final reports that they were completely fabricated. It was a honeypot essentially to smear him. All this stuff about harm and what he's like as a person, and all this kind of, I still get the sense that some people have that perception of him. But I think I kind of just took that opportunity when I spoke to those people just to try and kind of slowly nudge them in the right direction. And, despite the negative aspects of the case, there are lots of things to be hopeful about in terms of, even though some people left at the first day, kind of after the prosecution, there was a solid batch of at least 50 journalists that were there throughout the week. We had Kevin Gazzola there from Shadowproof, who's a great journalist. We had this project here in the UK, actually, which we should be good to highlight, called Bridges for Media Freedom. They had this website called AssangeCourt.report. They put out daily news reports, pictures from outside, and that's free for everyone to use. The watchdog will be looking to do something similar in the future. I'm going to be introducing some sort of changes and updates in the coming weeks. Again, I mentioned that problem of organizations becoming corrupted over time. So I have this particular solution in mind of how to avoid that, I think, hopefully. So that's something I'm working on. But again, I want to be providing my material out to people to use, essentially, help other people in independent media have access to this information. But yeah, so, the atmosphere was what it was. It was kind of, we had to be on our toes, because it was also, It could vary all the time. We had certain days where it was kind of long legal arguments for 2 or 3 hours, and kind of people start to lose focus. And then in 1 minute, we had this moment where the judge addressed Assange, and Assange stood up and gave this kind of big speech, and the whole atmosphere quickly changed because everyone kind of wanted to get the information and the quotes, and all the keyboards
Right.
started hammering away, etc. But yeah, I think in terms of what he's going through, I think a lot of supporters there feel that this is a show trial, and there was kind of a lot of frustration and sadness from those people.
Yeah. What's interesting, I don't know if you read this, you probably have, that Chelsea Manning was ordered by a judge to be released from her imprisonment. Chelsea Manning, of course, helped Assange obtain some a lot of important material that citizens should be privy to seeing, including the collateral murder video, which you can find on WikiLeaks. I think it's one of the first things they published. So I don't know what that bodes for Julian Assange, but hopefully it's a good sign that he's going to be released soon. But yeah, I just want to make the point too that I guess on the U.S. side of this, this sort of this persecution, there's Chelsea Manning as well, and we shouldn't forget about her. But anyway, just moving on with Assange, I read that at one point, obviously I've been reading his health has been deteriorating, his psychological and physical health. And at one point during the trial, he said that he couldn't hear what the judge and attorneys were saying. And it seemed like the judge made no concession to. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, sorry, my headphones just died.
Oh, okay.
It seems like the judge made no concession to make it easier for him. It seems he's being tortured in prison. So what is the attitude of the judge and the prosecution been as well? Have they been hostile toward Assange? Do you get that sense?
The prosecution hasn't particularly been hostile. You have to remember that this is just sort of a kind of aging lawyer, probably in his 50s or 60s. He's just sort of doing his job essentially. So he's just kind of presenting the arguments. So there's no kind of particular hostility there. Regarding the judge, I have to some things I'm not speculating, but a little bit of speculation. But to me, it's very clear. It's not something that you can maybe necessarily print on a piece of paper for an article, but it's very clear that, because it's obviously subjective, but the arguments the prosecution is presenting doesn't get very much pushback from the judge, whereas the arguments from the defense are getting a lot of pushback. But it's interesting, and it's worrying to note that, for example, some of the things that the defense were arguing is that Assange should not be extradited because he's a political prisoner. The US-UK treaty has an exception for political prisoners, a very kind of long protection for these types of offences. The judge was kind of unwilling to hear those arguments and accused the defense of having circular reasoning for bringing these things. And arguments about following international human law and the Geneva Conventions and that kind of thing just held no sway at all. Whereas when the prosecution was arguing that the political defense doesn't apply in this case, even though it's explicitly stated in the treaty, they got very little pushback. And then we had this incident where we talked about with the hearing. So, she did try to help a little bit. Some headphones were arranged to be given to him, but they weren't really sufficient. But it was also very telling because we had this incident where the lawyers had made the argument to bring him to sit with the lawyers alongside them. So he's not in the dock, in the glass dock. He's kind of in this bulletproof glass kind of container.
Oh, so he's isolated.
Yeah, he's isolated in the back of the room in this kind of like behind, 3-inch glass thick. Because you have to remember that Belmarsh is a maximum security prison where we usually hold like terrorists and that kind of thing. So he's there. The defense had presented evidence to show that there was precedent for defense to be able to sit with their lawyers. Even the prosecution said that they don't have a problem with Assange sitting with his lawyers. But we had this day where kind of 2 or 3 hours of argument, lots of compelling reasons for why he should be able to sit with his lawyers, including the fact that access to justice is dramatically reduced and it's not considered, fair if he's not able to participate. The judge just read from a piece of paper that was prepared prior to that argument. So it was kind of completely nonsensical waste of time that the lawyers came in and argued their cases, but the judge already had her decision made on a piece of paper. So it was kind of the biggest sign that this was really a show trial because, what was the point of all the arguing really if the decision's already been decided? Right.
And what was her justification for keeping things as they were?
There was there was 6 bullet points that she read out, and they were addressing the lawyer's specific concerns about spying, about not being able to communicate, about all these kind of things. So I can't remember specifics of what she said, but she said, she went through all of them and said, this is available or this option is possible. But they're all options that were not really feasible in the circumstances. So one kind of solution that she suggested was that anytime that Julian had wanted to speak to his lawyers, they could go take a break, and that the court would not be in session, and the lawyers could go down to the cells to talk with him privately if he so wished. Then the defense lawyers argued that that this would be an extremely lengthy process because it would take at least 20, 30 minutes just to kind of, do the handcuffing process to go down to the cells. The lawyers have to go through a security protocol to get down there. And they were saying this is completely, especially if you want to do it every few minutes, because, because he wants to be, if he's actually going to contribute to these proceedings, he's going to be wanting to be involved the whole time. So it's not actually a realistic solution. Also, it's also very good to know for context is that we had Tommy Robinson. I don't know if you're familiar with that name.
I'm familiar with the name, but if you could remind me.
So he is the leader of the EDL, the English Defence League, which is this far-right group in the UK.
Wasn't he the one that they tried to put through they tried to put him through some sort of training or something to make him less racist? There was something like that a few years ago, I think.
Potentially, I'm not sure.
It was some Guardian infotainment, but yeah, I remember him from that.
Yeah, so he had been found guilty of assaulting a police officer. So he's considered a violent criminal. But at a different court hearing, an application was made for him to be able to sit with his lawyers, and he was given that he was granted that permission. Whereas Assange has never committed a violent crime, and the United Nations considers him to be arbitrarily detained, and he's not able to sit with his lawyers. So I think it's very instructive to see it in contrast to that other example.
Yeah, and it strongly suggests that there's at least with the judge, there's an ideology that's pushing her to make the decisions. The decisions that she's making, they just seem ludicrous and in no way in line with due process. And I don't know if I suspect she's receiving pressure from outside entities, but it's hard to know. But it does seem like it's very it doesn't seem it's obviously very one-sided, and I don't think that anyone could in a fair mind call it a respectable trial thus far. But just to move on with the trial, I want to talk about Trump in all of this and how initially he was praising WikiLeaks and Assange, and there was the leak of the DNC emails. And then he apparently extended a pardon, and that was contingent upon Julian giving up the source of the DNC leaks. And once Julian refused to do so, basically Trump said, we're going to go after you. The pardon is rescinded. It was sort of a form of extortion. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit because there are a bunch of bizarre back channels to that story involving Roger Stone, Randy Credico, and then a bunch of other figures you covered, I believe, in a recent piece. There's Dana Rohrabacher, who was a former congressman, Sean Hannity, Reince Priebus, Steve Bannon, Rick Grinnell, who's the current director of national intelligence, and this person I've never heard of before, Arthur Schwartz, who's apparently Trump Jr.'s fixer. And then Kim.com, who's has a channel to Assange, and Sean Hannity, and journalist Cassandra Fairbanks, Seth Rich. I was wondering if we could just all kind of unpack that a little bit, what's going on there, because there's, as I said, these sort of bizarre back channels that are happening off radar that I don't think a lot of people know about.
Well, I think for context, so obviously probably a lot of people are aware of, in 2016, WikiLeaks put out the Podesta emails and the DNC leaks, which showed, unmistakable and highly grotesque criminal activity from Hillary Clinton that she should be in prison for. And, instead of actually addressing any of the corruption in their party or, any of the illegal activity, the Democratic Party and the sort of establishment around it kind of just birthed this Russian hacking sort of allegation, which is completely fabricated, and we've come to learn now. It's kind of now it's got to the point that it's blown up, and it's, I guess, much more public knowledge, but it was obvious from the very, very beginning that it was completely fabricated. But as a result of those disclosures that showed that, we obviously had the death of Seth Rich, which I wrote about, and others have discussed, that he was the source for those emails that reached WikiLeaks. He was a former DNC staffer. I believe he was a Bernie supporter that was kind of pissed off about the rigging against him, so that's why he kind of decided to leak it. He was found dead in Washington, D.C., kind of, I can't remember the time frames of all of this, but maybe several weeks after the leaks.
He was murdered.
Murdered, yeah, shot in the back twice. I've heard, actually, it wasn't mentioned in my piece where I reported it, but the amount of evidence for that is growing. So I've seen credible reports that he actually was alive when he was taken to the hospital. He died in hospital, not in the street. I've heard reports that he actually fought off the person that were trying to kill him. So he had like knife cuts all over his hands, which I think has been previously reported, or widely reported anyway. So there's lots of these little things starting to come out. The Judicial Watch are suing the FBI for documents about Seth Rich. There's I think maybe 3 other court cases at the moment in relation to Seth Rich. So actually, interestingly, there's a lot of support for Assange in right-wing and Republican circles because the death of Seth Rich obviously, has strong implications for the corruption of the Democratic Party. So and rightfully so, they should have an interest in kind of getting the truth out about that.
Right.
But I think kind of Trump, in his sort of typical, his style of politics, which is kind of much more closer to sort of a New York mafia boss than a politician. It was, he became aware of this knowledge. I think he knows exactly who Seth Rich was and all of these things. He wanted to make a deal that was beneficial for himself. He's in Kim.com's messages, we had, remind Trump of the art of the deal to kind of get this all sorted. But obviously, Assange, with his, very strict kind of moral code on sources and the protection of sources, which is extremely important, especially for the type of work WikiLeaks does. That's something that a line that he wasn't willing to cross, to kind of name who his source was, even though it's probably an area of WikiLeaks that I completely understand, but I maybe personally might have taken a different approach because, at the point that he's dead, he's not a source anymore, and it should be the source of a criminal investigation, in my opinion. And it's kind of like it's in your interests to be transparent about that. And but I do understand from Assange's perspective and WikiLeaks' perspective is that, and because Seth Rich is not the first source that's had been killed, there's not just for WikiLeaks. Worldwide, there's weapons inspectors or people that have leaked certain documents get killed, or had the journalist that uncovered the Panama Papers. She got killed in a car bomb. These truth tellers are often the victims of kind of reprisals and violence like this. So I understand completely why he wasn't wanting to give that information, because it also prevents. If in the news that a whistleblower has been killed and you're considering whistleblowing in the future, it makes you a little bit more reluctant. So, but I think, Trump just kind of wanted to make this deal he didn't really care about Seth Rich's family or the kind of greater justice. It was because it was politically convenient to him, to have this information out. And it seems like it was kind of out of spite that the Assange prosecution came because you refused. So, it was like, because you didn't help me, I'm going to, and that's the case that the lawyers for Assange will be making in court starting in May, that this is a politically motivated offence. The charges that came against Assange were, after the fact, that after the pardon had been made and that Assange had been refused. So it shows the political nature of these crimes, which they're undoubtedly political. It came after the fact that he refused. So, the fact that he was willing to pardon him, then not, I think shows, and is kind of this Trump's erratic kind of, well, if you're not going to help me, then, go to hell. You
quid pro quo, as we've been hearing.
I never want to hear those 3 words again. As a journalist, I think I was writing 3 or 4 quid pro quos a day, and I'm
Yeah.
so fed up of hearing it.
So just to clarify, you're not suggesting that there was any connection between Trump or his campaign and WikiLeaks. It's just that Trump took advantage of the email dump and then tried to capitalize on that further by offering this pardon. And then when he was rebuffed, he was kind of like, well, fuck you. I'm going to go businessman mode and rescind the pardon. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's no doubt that people from Trump's campaign met with, we know that Donald Rohrabacher went to the Ecuadorian embassy to meet with Trump. I'm sure maybe certain others had done so, but I don't think there's anything
with Trump or with Assange.
Sorry, with Assange, yeah. But I don't think there's anything controversial about that. He's to
visit him.
Yeah, he's a publisher and a journalist. He's going to have interactions with these kind of people. Especially with the kind of nature of the allegations that some people are putting against the Democratic Party. So it's completely understandable. But I don't think there's to say that there was anything nefarious going on is accurate. I mean, how it's kind of making the argument because there's no even real evidence that Trump colluded with Russia.
Exactly.
They're trying to make the argument that now Trump and WikiLeaks and Russia are all working together.
Yeah.
And now you're kind of seeing the circle grow more and more ridiculous. Anyone that questions this narrative is now kind of dumped into this Russian group of exiles, whatever. And it's just the list is just becoming ridiculous. Like in the UK, we say again.
You're a Russian asset.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever that means.
So yeah, and I think to most people now it's becoming patently obvious.
Yeah. But what was interesting, I think, in reading about these sort of back channels is that so you have Cassandra Fairbanks, who's I guess you would characterize as a conservative journalist. She did some reporting on Assange and pointed out some contradictions in the official narrative, and she received threats, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. So then there's also I emailed you this piece last night, and you said you were familiar with it. The one that Craig Murray put out, his I think it was a phone call interview with Randy Credico, or Credico. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he talked about Credico talked about Roger Stone and the whole I guess hoax that he tried to parlay for a while, that he had a back channel to WikiLeaks, and that he had that back channel on behalf of the Trump campaign. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and that sort of bizarre aspect of Assange's situation, where you have this sort of this huckster, this career huckster who did PR for war criminals in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s. He's kind of trying to ingratiate himself back into the Trump administration after being booted by saying he has a connection to Assange, and he's just dumping or providing information that's already public. But anyway, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. I mean, I don't know the exact specifics, but it was a very peculiar case because And I still, kind of scratch my head trying to understand exactly what was going on. But yeah, I think, he claimed to make this back channel, which there's no evidence for. We still have seen no evidence for any of these allegations.
And he's in prison now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't even know how I feel about him being in prison, because I think he technically was guilty of being in contempt of court for lying.
Right.
So I guess that is justified, but it's such a kind of web, because the kind of implications of his lies are, damaging to other people, but it's a big web of a complicated mess. But it's afraid I can't say too much more on that, other than it's just kind of, to me, I think it's a tangential thing, but the one thing it does show is that how the Democratic Party is kind of keen to just get anyone they can get kind of grab into this Russian narrative that they can. Manafort, this guy as well, and so. Yeah, that's the impression I get, but to me, it seems like an issue.
Yeah, I just think it's dangerous in terms of Roger Stone, because you have someone like this making these claims, and you have very unscrupulous coverage by mainstream media, and you get blips here and there. Oh, he might be connected to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks might be working on behalf of Russia, on behalf of Trump. And then you hear about him. But if you're only consuming that mainstream media and getting those blips, you immediately associate Roger Stone's guilt with Assange's guilt. And you can extrapolate from there if you want to. And I think that's one reason that I think what Roger Stone did was not only foolish, but very dangerous for Assange, because even though Stone is full of shit, it still casts Assange in a certain light to people who may not be aware of the details of the case, or have a received opinion about Assange. But yeah, that's why I wanted to touch upon that, because I think it carries more import and perhaps deserves a little more coverage than it's gotten, because the risk it poses to Julian. But
Patrick Henningsen at 21st Century Wire has done several good pieces on that. So for yourself or others that want to focus in on that, I think that's a good resource to try and look into that.
Okay, great. And then, so I guess the last thing I want to ask about Assange before we wrap up is how does he seem to be doing? How does we've heard reports about his health deteriorating, but how did he seem in person to you? Did he seem lucid? Did he seem aware of what was going on?
Yeah, I've made this point before, but I think he's someone that's, he's obviously someone that's extremely bright and intelligent and well-read. I think he understands the position that he's in. This kind of, sorry to repeat myself in other podcasts, but, he was someone that was reading Solzhenitsyn at a very young age, and he was kind of made jokes about how Solzhenitsyn's life was so much like his own. Obviously, he kind of didn't, that was when he was 25 or so, but now his life really is like Solzhenitsyn's.
Right.
This Russian political exile. But to be honest, even though he does seem kind of at times quite tired and a little bit out of it, and sometimes you can see him being frustrated with the process, because, he's almost bored, because he is completely not a part of the proceedings. But other times, he was, we had little breaks in the courtroom, and the lawyers would come and talk to him through the window, and he was making all of them laugh, being extremely charismatic. at the end of every day, he would look up to the public gallery and he'd be raising his fist to people, and he was, thanking them for their support.
That's great.
So I think, he is obviously what he's going through is terrible and torturous, and wouldn't wish it on anyone.
Right.
But I think he's not only someone that's very intelligent, but he's someone with like a very strong will of mind, and he is someone that's very principled. So he kind of he's handling that situation, and I think he's kind of giving other people a sort of the strength to kind of continue fighting for him. And I think just personally, I had this very kind of mixed feeling at the end of the week, because it's such a negative case.
Mm-hmm.
Support for him that was there, and like talking with all the other journalists and seeing all the different initiatives that people were involved in. It wasn't just my organization. There was others that are kind of thinking about journalism going forward. There's, meeting the people from the Courage Foundation and Kevin from Shadowproof and all these different people. It was very uplifting to see that there is this groundswell of support for Assange and journalism in general. But we have to kind of remind ourselves of the circumstances that we're in. But
right.
But there are positives, and we just all have to kind of build on that and kind of have faith in working together to try and kind of improve this situation.
Yeah. I think, just to add a little bit to that, I think Julian's an amazing person. Like you said, principled, intelligent, charismatic, and it's been horrible to see, what his kidnapping, his confinement, his kidnapping, and then his secondary confinement have done to him. But it's a testament to, I think, it's a testament to how far you can push yourself to stand by your principles, even under basically what amount to state crimes against humanity, in my opinion, the way they've been treating him both in court and in prison. But it's good to hear that he's still got the moxie, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So there was the 1 week of the extradition hearings, and then they're resuming in May.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of sort of preliminary hearings, case management in April, and one in March, but they're just sort of not much is going to come out. It's just kind of scheduling and that kind of thing. But yeah, we're starting again on the 18th of May.
Okay.
And that should be for 3 weeks, but it could go on for longer. And that's when we're going to start having the actual evidence and the statements come in. So we'll hear from Cassandra Fairbanks, and we'll hear about the spying in the embassy, and we'll hear about even plots to assassinate Assange and kidnap him while he was in the embassy. So yeah, we'll start to hear all that kind of thing in May.
All right. Looking forward to that. So you'll be covering that on thewatchdog.net.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, yeah, just lastly, we could just completely switch subjects and just talk for a minute or two about your writing outside of journalism. I know you and I share a mutual love of hip hop. Yeah, maybe just what writing are you interested in outside of journalism? What were you trying to write a novel when you took that 2-year break?
Yeah, I was trying to write a novel. I was very interested in, well, lots of things, but I became very interested in always been very interested in philosophy, but kind of starting to understand mythology and kind of the history of religion. It was kind of through the writing process that I kind of came to want to understand that. But now that I've kind of gone on this long journey of trying to understand mythology, it's kind of really changed the way I view many things. It's really opened up my vision of how the world works. It can sound a little bit silly, but you start to see patterns in symbolism and in mythology that are kind of the basis of every mythological story, and these stories exist in various different cultures across time, and then you start to notice the same patterns happening in your own culture, in your own life, and it can be very kind of enriching to have that perspective. Kind of philosophy, spirituality, Russian literature I really love. Dostoevsky's kind of my hero. And so that's probably why I never finished my book, because I was comparing myself to Dostoevsky, and that's kind of what I was aiming for. I always had this image or this thought of, there's no point in writing unless I'm going to be writing at that level. Right. So I ended up just doing I finished 4 completed drafts, but I've never really read it and been happy with it. So it's something that will have to kind of go onto the back burner for a while.
Yeah. But do you anticipate going back to that at some point in the future?
I might do, but I'll tell you a kind of a funny story, or maybe on how funny it is, but so I'm kind of a strong believer that art and writing is kind of this way of communicating with your subconscious and feelings that we don't know that are there. And I think that's what good artists do. They get a sense of like the underlying feeling that's in the culture, and they express it for the first time. So the strange thing is, obviously, the book that I was writing was sort of autobiographical. The character was based on me, as is typically the case when people try to write.
Right.
So obviously kind of my own life filtered into that, but things that I'd wrote about in the book that were completely fictional, but based on sort of some of my circumstances, actually turned out to happen in real life. So it's kind of, instead of art imitating life, it was life imitating art. So it was kind of like, it was almost like this kind of like seance type thing that was telling me, and actually, completely strangely too, the last chapter of my book was supposed to be me in a court case, for like a personal court case, and it felt like a show trial where I couldn't express the philosophy that I wanted to, like
a Kafka-esque sort of situation.
So it was kind of very strange that after everything that happened with Newsweek, and on the last day of the court, I had myself kind of all suddenly kind of rained on me that, like, oh, I'm actually like sitting in this courtroom that is a show trial. After I had this kind of big crazy thing that happened at Newsweek, and there was lots of kind of, it wasn't the same as what I'd written about, but there was lots of kind of similar patterns of how everything happened.
Yeah.
It's kind of a really interesting process to be a part of.
I find that happens sometimes in my own creative writing, that I sort of I'm writing based off of lived experience, but it's almost at the same time I'm writing myself into future lived experiences, if that makes sense. But
I'll give you, I guess, like an example is that I in the book, I had this like relationship that kind of, I formulated this completely made up person that was probably like an amalgam of all my ex-girlfriends, unfortunately. But obviously, like I kind of put in my own problems and worries. But someone that I was seeing after the character had been invented, we ended up sort of breaking up in the exact same way that I had written about, because it was obviously kind of like internal things that I was dealing with that kind of caused the friction. And so it was strange to go and read those pages back, where it was like, it was me expressing my like insecurities in about myself in a relationship, and then it was like you saw them come to light afterwards.
Right.
But it actually kind of made me able to deal with that breakup and that situation much better, because it was like, oh, I'm starting to understand this problem of why I'm doing this with women, or this kind of bad relationship behaviors or whatever.
You've worked through it to some extent in the writing.
Trying to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. One piece of writing advice I was given was by actually a great writer, Colin McCann. He's an Irish novelist. He lives in New York now. But he told me once when I met him, I think it was at a reading, and I was getting my book signed, and he said, I just asked him for some quick advice, and he said, you should write what you don't know. And I took that to heart for a long time, and then I thought, but it was keeping me from writing about myself, like in any autobiographical capacity. And I thought about that for a while, and if you think about it, like, who really knows themselves that well, let alone anybody else, right? So if you're writing about yourself, you are essentially writing about what you don't know, to find out about yourself and how you interact with others and how your relationships are. So I've kind of given up on that that motto, and I think that a lot of the fiction that appeals to me today has a highly autobiographical slant to it, but you can't tell what's autobiographical and what isn't. And so yeah, just an interesting point to dovetail off of what you were saying. Yeah, lastly, let's just talk about hip hop, man. Like, how did you at a young age became a fan and a listener, and what was that all about?
I think I know what kind of was responsible, but it's one of those things I don't really know. But I think it's because obviously I grew up in Jordan in the Middle East, and I was always kind of had what's the right word? Like a pre-interest, like a pre-existing sort of what's the right words? Like something gravitated me towards beats, and like there's an Arabic instrument called the tabla.
There was something intuitive about it. You were just kind of
and like in Arabic, there's like a hand drum, and like the beats are a big part of the music, like the hand drumming and like that kind of thing. And I think it was partly that I've always I love the lyricism in hip hop and all that kind of thing, but also to me it's probably primarily been about the beats, which is always kind of just something that's kind of I felt on a kind of deep level. And then it was also, I was a bit of an outsider, even though it's kind of not the typical whatever person that would listen to hip hop, but I came to the UK as an immigrant, and everyone else was listening to Slipknot, and I don't even know who else was around at the time. But to me, I just had no connection or interest in Slipknot, and it just the first actual album that I first ever bought was Marshall Mathers Slim Shady LP, or whatever. I can't remember what it's called. Marshall Mathers LP.
Yeah, I was going to ask you which was the first record you got, but okay, there you go. First Eminem, yeah.
And then also I had the College Dropout.
Kanye.
Before that, but I guess I didn't even think of it as hip hop at the time, but it's just come to me. I had a cassette of the Gorillaz, like that that really early Dirty Harry song. And is that Dirty Harry? Yeah.
I'm actually not familiar. I know who the Gorillaz are, but I don't know their music.
The album is good. I think it's the people that are in Blur, which is this other English band, kind of very famous.
Oh yeah, Blur, of course.
I think it's the same people. Don't quote me on that. But the album that Dirty Harry's on is like a really cool album, really old school. And then you've sent me, was it Billy Woods, which I've been listening to a lot.
Nice.
Still, really good.
Yeah. To anybody who's listening, if you're into hip hop, I recommend Billy Woods. I think he's originally from the DC area, but he's Brooklyn based now.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent lyricist, really interesting beats, really interesting production. And he touches on, I mean, he has a song called Houthi, like what other rapper out there nowadays has a song called Houthi, you know? Or there's the one song where he references the siege at Mecca in 79, in 1979 in Saudi Arabia, and he just drops a lot of really interesting political references and sort of interweaves them into daily life, and sort of how you were saying earlier, shows that everything's connected to some degree. So yeah, he's a really good one.
And there's another one that's like that is I think he's starting to make the rounds in the US a bit more, but Loki.
Okay.
He's a really interesting one. I think like a little bit more. No, I wouldn't say he's more mainstream, but he's again. I mean, Billy Woods is a lot more, I guess, like to the streets, and it's a bit more grimy, which is I really like. But Loki is very interesting. I've always been someone that's been trying to like push British rap on people, and my American friends are like, "Get out of here! You don't know what you're talking about. Leave hip hop to us." But with him, I think like he's someone for Americans that they should watch out for. He's really interesting, and he's like very political in his messaging. I think he's been on the Empire Files with Abby Martin and stuff.
Oh, nice. Yeah, great.
Yeah, his music's really cool. So,
all right, I'll check that out. And anyone who's listening who's into hip hop, check that out. Low key. What was I gonna say? Last thing, just about British hip hop. There's actually a lot of good hip hop coming out of the UK. I don't know if you're aware of Cass is Dead. Have you heard of him?
I've heard the name. I haven't heard.
Yeah, I think just based on our mutual the things we like in hip hop, I think you'd be down for his jams. But yeah, it's Cass is Dead, all one word, all uppercase. I recommend it to everybody else. Yeah, so don't sleep on British hip hop. All right, Tareq, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. I hope I found it productive and insightful. I hope that you did as well. And I wasn't anticipating doing the video, but since we did that, I'll probably move it to YouTube as opposed to SoundCloud. Do the editing this weekend and let you know when it's posted in a few days. But so Tareq Haddad was my guest today. He formerly reported at Newsweek. He's a founder and journalist with The Watchdog, thewatchdog.net. His website is tareqhaddad.com. I recommend that you visit both and follow his work. And you're on Twitter at Tareq Haddad.
_Haddad, yeah.
Okay, Tareq_Haddad. You can follow him for regular updates there. So thank you everybody for listening, and thank you very much, Tareq. I really do appreciate it. Okay, have a good night.
All right.
Cheers.
Cool. All right, see you, man.